The parched Wyoming dirt swallowed Sarah Fletcher's tears as they dripped from her sunburned face, the iron bars of the cage burning her skin whenever she shifted position. 3 days in this prison, displayed like an animal in Broken Ridge's town square, with only the occasional ladle of murky water pushed between the bars by sneering townspeople who believed the lies about her being a horse thief. It was 1876, and justice in Wyoming territory often meant whatever the most powerful men in town decided it meant. Sarah had made the mistake of refusing Sheriff Dawson's unwanted advances, and now she was paying the price. Her once vibrant auburn hair hung in limp strands around her face, and her blue calico dress was stained with dust and sweat. "Water," she croaked, her voice barely audible as another group of townspeople passed by, some averting their eyes while others stared with a mixture of pity and disgust. None stopped to help. The sun climbed higher, baking the metal cage until it became nearly untouchable. Sarah had learned to balance on the wooden slats of the floor, avoiding contact with the iron as much as possible. Her thoughts drifted to her small homestead outside of town, wondering if her chickens were still alive, if her garden had withered in her absence. "Gonna die out here," she murmured, closing her eyes against the merciless sun. The sheriff had promised her release after she'd learned her lesson. But Sarah was beginning to suspect that her lesson was meant to be a permanent one. The distant thunder of hoofbeats barely registered in her heat-addled mind. She'd heard many horses come and go over the past days, none bringing salvation. But these hoofbeats didn't pass by, they grew louder, more purposeful, until they stopped right in front of her cage. Sarah forced her swollen eyes open, squinting against the harsh light. A tall figure on horseback blocked the sun, his features indistinct in the sudden shadow he cast. "Madam," the deep voice said, "looks like you're having a rough day." "Understatement," Sarah managed to reply, her cracked lips barely able to form the word. The man dismounted in one fluid motion, revealing himself to be tall and broad-shouldered, dressed in trail-worn clothes with a dusty black hat pulled low over his face. He approached the cage cautiously, his spurs jingling with each step. "Name's Henry Lawson," he said, kneeling beside the cage to examine the heavy padlock. "Mind telling me why you're locked up like this?" "Refused. The sheriff," Sarah whispered. "Said I stole horses." Henry's expression darkened. "Sheriff Dawson, I take it." When she nodded weakly, he muttered, "Known him to have a mean streak, especially with ladies who don't return his affections." He stood and looked around the nearly empty town square. It was midday, and most folks were indoors escaping the heat. Only a few people watched from doorways, their expressions wary. "Well, Miss Fletcher, Sarah Fletcher. Miss Fletcher, I don't much like seeing a woman treated this way, guilty or not." He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a canteen, carefully pushing it through the bars. "Drink slow now." The water was like heaven on her parched lips and throat. Sarah forced herself to sip slowly, knowing too much too fast would make her sick. Henry studied the lock, then glanced toward the sheriff's office across the square. "I don't suppose they'll just hand me the key if I ask politely." Sarah shook her head. "Sheriff's gone hunting, back tomorrow." Henry's jaw tightened. "Tomorrow might be too late for you in this heat." He stood and returned to his horse, a magnificent black stallion that watched them with intelligent eyes. From another saddlebag, he withdrew a small leather pouch. "Lucky for you," he said, kneeling again by the lock. "I wasn't always on the right side of the law myself." He extracted several thin metal tools from the pouch and began working on the padlock with practiced hands. "You're breaking me out?" Sarah asked, her mind clearing slightly from the water. "Let's just say I'm expediting your release," Henry replied, his eyes focused on his work. I've been tracking a gang across 3 territories. Stopped here for supplies and found you instead. Seems like fate had other plans for me today." The lock clicked open after several tense minutes and Henry swung the cage door wide. "Can you stand?" Sarah tried to rise but collapsed back to the wooden floor, her legs too weak from days of confinement and dehydration. Without hesitation, Henry reached in and gathered her into his arms, lifting her as if she weighed nothing. The contact with another human being, one who wasn't trying to harm her, nearly broke Sarah's composure. "My homestead," she murmured against his shoulder. 3 miles north, please." "We can't," Henry said grimly. "First place they'll look. Sheriff might be gone, but his deputies aren't." He carried her to his horse and carefully helped her into the saddle before mounting behind her. "We need to put distance between us and this town." As he urged his horse forward, Sarah heard shouts behind them. Looking back, she saw 2 men emerging from the saloon, pointing in their direction. "Hold tight," Henry commanded. And then they were galloping down the main street and out of Broken Ridge, Sarah's prison shrinking behind them. They rode hard for nearly an hour, the landscape changing from dusty plains to rolling hills dotted with scrub brush and the occasional pine. Henry guided his horse with confident expertise, keeping Sarah secure against his chest with one strong arm. Eventually, they slowed near a small stream tucked into a sheltered draw. "We'll rest here," Henry said, dismounting and lifting Sarah down. Her legs buckled immediately, and he caught her, easing her to sit against a boulder in the shade. "You need more water and food." He tended to his horse first, removing the saddle and bridle and allowing the animal to drink from the stream. Then he returned to Sarah with the canteen and a small bundle of jerky and hardtack from his provisions. "Eat slowly," he advised, settling beside her. "Your stomach won't be used to much after days without." Sarah nibbled at the jerky, savoring the salty taste. "Why did you help me?" she asked when she felt strong enough to speak properly. Henry removed his hat, revealing dark brown hair and eyes the color of well-worn leather. His face was weathered from years in the sun, with a thin scar running along his jaw, but his expression was kind. "My sister was mistreated by a man with authority once," he said simply. "I wasn't there to help her. I promised myself I'd never pass by someone who needed help again, especially a woman being wronged. Your sister, is she?" "Dead, 5 years now." His voice was matter-of-fact, but Sarah saw the pain in his eyes. "I'm sorry," she said softly. Henry nodded acknowledgement and stood. "We should move again soon. They might have riders out looking for us." "Where will we go?" Sarah asked, the reality of her situation settling in. She couldn't return to her homestead, not with the sheriff determined to punish her. "I've got a friend with a cabin about 2 days' ride from here. We can lie low there while we figure out what to do about your situation." Henry glanced at her torn and dirty dress. "First, though, we need to find you some more suitable clothes for traveling." They continued north and east, keeping to less traveled paths through increasingly wooded terrain. By sunset, they reached a small trading post beside a creek. The elderly couple who ran it asked no questions when Henry purchased trousers, a shirt, boots, and a hat for Sarah, along with food supplies and ammunition. Behind a screen in the trading post's back room, Sarah changed into her new clothing. The trousers felt strange against her legs after years of dresses, but she admitted they made more sense for riding. When she emerged, Henry nodded approvingly. "Much better for where we're headed," he said. "How are you feeling?" "Stronger," Sarah replied, surprised to realize it was true. Food, water, and the absence of the burning cage had revived her considerably. "Though I'd kill for a proper bath." "Creek's cold but clean," the trading post owner's wife offered. "Got soap if you want it. 15 minutes of privacy is all I can promise, though. That brief, frigid bath was perhaps the most wonderful experience of Sarah's life. She scrubbed away days of grime and humiliation, feeling human again. With her hair washed and her body clean, she rejoined Henry outside where he was checking their supplies. "We should keep moving," he said. "Get a few more miles before full dark." They rode through the twilight, the horse carrying them both at an easy trot. Sarah found herself increasingly aware of Henry's solid presence behind her, his arm occasionally brushing her waist as he guided the horse around obstacles. "Have you always been a bounty hunter?" she asked as stars began appearing overhead. "Started 5 years ago after my sister," Henry replied. "Before that, I worked cattle, did some scouting for the army, learned to track from a Shoshone man who took a liking to me when I was young." "And you're good at it, hunting men, good enough to stay alive." There was no boasting in his tone. "The gang I'm after now has robbed 3 banks and killed 7 people, including 2 children. They need stopping." Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cooling night air. "And after you catch them, there's always another job." He guided the horse around a fallen tree. "What about you? How'd you end up with your own homestead?" "My husband died 2 years ago. Fever took him quick," Sarah explained. "We just finished building the cabin and clearing fields. Everyone expected me to sell and move back east to my family, but it was our dream, that land. I couldn't leave it. Brave thing, a woman working a homestead alone." "Not brave, stubborn," Sarah smiled slightly. "My father always said I had more stubbornness than sense. But I was making it work until Sheriff Dawson decided I should be warming his bed instead of my own." Henry's arm tightened momentarily around her waist, a protective gesture that Sarah found oddly comforting. They made camp in a small clearing, Henry insisting on taking the first watch while Sarah slept wrapped in his bedroll. Despite her exhaustion, sleep came fitfully, her dreams filled with iron bars and burning sun. She woke with a gasp sometime in the night to find Henry sitting nearby, his rifle across his knees. "Bad dreams?" he asked quietly. Sarah nodded, pushing herself upright. "I keep feeling the cage around me." "That'll pass with time." He offered her the canteen. "My turn to sleep if you're up." "I can keep watch," Sarah agreed, accepting his revolver when he handed it to her. "I'm a fair shot. My husband made sure of that." Henry settled himself on the ground, hat pulled over his face. "Wake me if you hear anything unusual, even if you're not sure." Sarah watched over him as the night deepened, studying his features in the moonlight. There was a gentleness to him that belied his dangerous profession, a kindness in how he'd treated her from the moment they met. She couldn't remember the last time a man had shown her such respect. The next day brought them deeper into the mountains, the trail growing steeper and the trees taller. Sarah's strength continued to return, and by midday she felt almost herself again, if sore from riding. They stopped to rest by a mountain stream where Henry shot a rabbit for their lunch. As Sarah helped prepare the meat, she noticed Henry watching her hands work. "Something wrong?" she asked. "Just thinking you handle a knife like someone who knows what they're doing," he replied. "Most city women I've known would be squeamish about dressing game." "I'm not a city woman," Sarah reminded him. "I've been butchering my own meat since I was 16. My father believed in practical education." "Smart man," Henry commented, building a small, smokeless fire to cook their meal. They ate in companionable silence, the rabbit meat tender and flavorful. Afterward, as Henry kicked dirt over the fire's remains, Sarah gathered her courage to ask the question that had been bothering her. "What happens after we reach your friend's cabin? I can't go back to my homestead." Henry straightened, his expression thoughtful. "I need to complete my job. These men I'm tracking killed a family in Colorado. There's a substantial bounty on them. And me, Sarah pressed. My friend Jack can help get word to the territorial marshal about Sheriff Dawson's behavior. Might take time, but the law's not completely corrupt. Henry paused. In the meantime, Jack's wife could use help. Their place is remote enough that news from Broken Ridge won't reach them. It wasn't a permanent solution, but it was more than Sarah had dared hope for. "Thank you," she said simply. Henry nodded, seemingly uncomfortable with her gratitude. We should keep moving. Still a day's ride to Jack's place. That afternoon, they crossed a high ridge and were rewarded with a spectacular view of the valley beyond. Pine forests stretching as far as the eye could see, broken only by meadows glowing golden in the late summer sun. "It's beautiful," Sarah breathed. "Wyoming has its moments," Henry agreed, pausing to let her and the horse rest. "Different kind of beauty than back east, I expect." "I grew up in Pennsylvania," Sarah said. "Green hills, orderly farms, this is wilder." "That's why I love it," Henry admitted. "Room to breathe out here. No one telling you who to be." As they descended into the valley, Sarah found herself studying Henry's profile, wondering about the life he'd led before becoming a bounty hunter. There was education in his speech, refinement beneath the rugged exterior. She sensed depths to him that intrigued her, mysteries she found herself wanting to unravel. They made camp that evening beside a small lake, its waters reflecting the fiery sunset. Henry had grown quieter throughout the day, occasionally scanning their back trail with a frown. "You think they're following us?" Sarah asked as she helped gather wood for the fire. "Possibly," Henry admitted. "Sawdust a few times today might be nothing. Or might be the sheriff's men," Sarah concluded grimly. "We'll leave before first light," Henry decided. "Push hard tomorrow." Jack's place isn't far. That night, huddled close to the small fire, Sarah found herself shivering despite the relatively mild temperature. The events of the past days were catching up to her, the trauma of the cage, the uncertainty of her future. Henry noticed and wordlessly handed her his coat, a heavy canvas garment that smelled of horses, gunpowder, and pine scents she was beginning to associate with safety. "Will you tell me about your sister?" Sarah asked softly, drawing the coat around her shoulders. Henry was silent for so long she thought he might not answer. Finally, he spoke, his voice low. "Her name was Catherine. Everyone called her Cat. She was fierce, smart as a whip, wanted to be a doctor if you can believe it. What happened to her?" "Town marshal where we lived in Kansas took a liking to her. She wasn't interested. One night, he cornered her walking home from her job at the general store." Henry's voice hardened. "I was working a cattle drive. By the time I got back, she'd taken her own life." "Couldn't live with the shame," the note said. "Oh, Henry," Sarah whispered, her heart breaking for him. "Marshall denied everything. Town backed him up. Law's supposed to protect people, not prey on them." He poked at the fire with a stick, sparks rising into the night. "That's when I started hunting men with bounties. Figured if I couldn't get justice for Cat, I could at least get it for others." Sarah reached across the space between them and placed her hand on his arm. "I'm so sorry." Henry covered her hand with his own, the touch sending unexpected warmth through her. "Get some sleep, Sarah. Tomorrow will be a long day." Morning came with a heavy mist rising from the lake, obscuring visibility beyond a few yards. They ate a cold breakfast and packed quickly, Henry's vigilance increased by the reduced visibility. As they rode out, Sarah sensed his tension in the set of his shoulders and the way his hand rested near his holstered revolver. They'd traveled perhaps an hour when Henry suddenly reined in, his head cocked as if listening. Sarah heard it, 2 horses approaching, multiple riders by the sound of it. "Into the trees," Henry whispered urgently, guiding his mount off the trail and into the dense pines. They dismounted, and Henry tied his horse securely before drawing his rifle. "Stay behind me." The riders emerged from the mist moments later, 4 men, armed and moving with purpose. Sarah recognized 2 of them as Sheriff Dawson's deputies. "They've been tracking us," she whispered, fear clenching her stomach. "They haven't seen us yet," Henry murmured. "If they pass by," but the lead rider halted, pointing to the ground. "Tracks here, fresh ones," Henry cursed under his breath. "Change of plans." He turned to Sarah, his expression intense. "There's a creek about 50 yards that way," he nodded eastward. "Follow it downstream. It leads to a waterfall, and behind it is a small cave. Wait for me there." "What are you going to do?" Sarah asked, alarmed. "Create a diversion." "Draw them away from you." He pressed his revolver into her hand. "Take this. Don't hesitate to use it if needed." "Henry, go now while they're still on the trail." He squeezed her shoulder. "I'll find you, Sarah, I promise." Heart pounding, Sarah slipped away through the trees, moving as quietly as possible toward the creek Henry had mentioned. Behind her, she heard Henry moving in the opposite direction, deliberately making noise to draw attention. Moments later, shouts erupted, followed by the thunder of hooves as the pursuit began. Sarah found the creek and waded into its cold water, following it downstream as instructed. The roar of a waterfall soon reached her ears, growing louder as she approached. The cascade wasn't large, perhaps 15 feet high, but the water fell with enough force to create a constant mist. Behind it, just as Henry had said, was a narrow opening in the rock face. She squeezed through into a shallow cave, damp and cool but offering concealment. There she waited, clutching Henry's revolver, straining to hear anything beyond the waterfall's constant roar. Minutes stretched into an hour, then 2. Sarah's wet clothes clung uncomfortably to her skin, and worry for Henry gnawed at her. What if he'd been captured? Or worse? Just as she was debating whether to venture out, a shadow appeared at the cave entrance. Sarah raised the revolver, her finger tensing on the trigger. "Sarah, it's me." Relief flooded through her as Henry ducked into the cave, water streaming from his hat and clothes. He had a fresh cut on his cheek but appeared otherwise unharmed. "You're hurt," she said, lowering the gun. "It's nothing." He removed his hat, shaking water from it. "Led them on a merry chase up into the high country, lost them in a box canyon. They'll be searching in the wrong direction for hours yet. Will they give up, eventually? Sheriff's jurisdiction only stretches so far." Henry sat heavily beside her, wincing slightly. "Jack's place is less than 3 hours from here. We should be safe by nightfall." Only then did Sarah notice he was holding his side, blood seeping between his fingers. "You're wounded." "One of them got lucky," Henry admitted. "Bullet grazed my ribs, stings like hell, but it's not deep." Sarah set the revolver down and moved to examine the wound. "Take off your shirt." "I need to see how bad it is." Henry complied with surprising docility, revealing a torso muscled from years of hard work and marred by several old scars. The fresh wound was indeed a graze, painful but not life-threatening. Sarah tore a strip from her shirt and used creek water to clean the injury before binding it as best she could. "You've done this before," Henry observed, watching her work. "My husband was a clumsy man," Sarah replied with a sad smile. "Always cutting or bruising himself. I got plenty of practice." "You loved him very much," Henry said. "It wasn't a question." "I did." Sarah secured the bandage. "We had 5 good years together, more than some get." When she finished, her hands lingered briefly on his skin and their eyes met. Something unspoken passed between them, a current of awareness that had been building since the moment he'd freed her from the cage. Henry's hand came up to touch her cheek, his calloused fingers gentle against her skin. "Sarah," he said softly, her name almost a question. The moment was broken by distant shouts echoing through the forest. Henry immediately tensed, reaching for his rifle. "They're closer than I thought," he muttered. "We need to move." They slipped from the cave and retrieved Henry's horse, which he'd hidden nearby. With Sarah riding behind him this time, they set off at a pace that balanced speed with stealth, avoiding open areas where they might be spotted from a distance. The terrain grew increasingly rugged as they traveled, forcing them to dismount and lead the horse through particularly difficult passages. Henry's wound clearly pained him, though he made no complaint. Sarah found herself supporting him on the steepest climbs, his arm heavy across her shoulders. Late afternoon brought them to a high meadow dotted with wildflowers, a small cabin visible at its far edge, smoke rising peacefully from the chimney. "Jack's place," Henry said with evident relief. "Made it." They were halfway across the meadow when the cabin door opened, and a bearded man emerged, rifle in hand. He squinted in their direction, then lowered his weapon and waved. "Henry, you old wolf," the man called. "Thought you were headed to Colorado." "Change of plans, Jack," Henry replied as they approached. Jack's friendly expression turned to concern as he noticed Henry's bandaged side and Sarah's presence. "Trouble, some," Henry admitted. "This is Sarah Fletcher. She needs a safe place for a while." Jack's wife, Martha, appeared in the doorway, a plump, kind-faced woman who immediately took charge upon seeing Henry's condition and Sarah's exhaustion. Within minutes, they were inside the cozy cabin, Henry's wound being properly tended while Sarah was given fresh clothes and a bowl of hearty stew. As night fell, Sarah found herself sitting on the cabin's small porch, wrapped in a borrowed quilt and watching stars appear in the vast Wyoming sky. The door creaked behind her, and Henry joined her, moving stiffly but looking better with his wound properly dressed. "Martha says you can stay as long as you need," he said, settling onto the bench beside her. "Jack's already drafting a letter to the territorial marshal about Sheriff Dawson." "And you?" Sarah asked, the question that had been weighing on her mind finally spoken. Henry was quiet for a moment, his eyes on the distant mountains. "I still have a job to finish. Those men I've been tracking. They need to answer for what they've done. When will you leave?" "2 days. Need to let this heal a bit first." He gestured to his side. Sarah nodded, trying to hide her disappointment. Of course he would continue his hunt. It was his livelihood, his purpose. She had no claim on him, despite the connection she felt growing between them. "Sarah," Henry said hesitantly, "I've been thinking. When this job is done, I could come back. If you wanted." She turned to look at him, hope rising unbidden. "What about your next bounty? Been thinking about that too." Henry shifted to face her. 5 years of hunting men. Maybe it's time for something different. Can't bring Kat back, and vengeance hasn't filled the hole she left. "What would you do instead?" Sarah asked softly. "Jack mentioned that the property adjoining his is for sale. Good land, water rights. Could build something there." His eyes held hers. "If I had a reason to." Sarah's heart quickened. "Are you asking me something, Henry Lawson?" "I know it's sudden," he said, suddenly uncertain. "We've only known each other 3 days, but I feel—" He broke off, searching for words. "I feel it too," Sarah admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Henry took her hand, his grip warm and steady. "I'm not proposing marriage, not yet. That would be too fast, even for me." His smile was gentle in the starlight. "But I am asking if you'd consider giving me a chance to court you properly when I return, to see if what we both feel might grow into something lasting." Sarah thought of her homestead, now lost to her. Of the lonely years since her husband's death. Of the connection she'd felt with Henry from the moment he'd freed her from that cage. Not just gratitude, but something deeper, a recognition of kindred spirits. "I'd like that," she said, squeezing his hand. "Very much." They sat in companionable silence as the night deepened around them. the future suddenly holding possibilities Sarah hadn't dared imagine when she'd been trapped behind those iron bars. Whatever came next, she wouldn't face it alone. A month later, as autumn painted the Wyoming mountains in gold and crimson, Sarah stood on the same porch, watching a rider approach through the meadow. Henry sat tall in the saddle, his silhouette unmistakable even at a distance. As he drew closer, she saw he was leading a second horse, a pretty chestnut mare with a white blaze. He dismounted with easy grace, his wound fully healed, his face lighting with a smile when he saw her waiting. "I brought you something," he said, gesturing to the mare. "Figured if you're going to stay in these mountains, you'll need a good horse of your own." "She's beautiful," Sarah said, approaching to stroke the mare's velvet nose. "Does this mean—" "Job's done," Henry confirmed. "Bounty collected, and I've put a deposit on that land we talked about." He stepped closer, taking her hands in his. "I meant what I said, Sarah. I want to build something here, something that lasts." Sarah rose on tiptoe and pressed her lips to his, a kiss that held the promise of all that might come: a home, a life, love born in the most unlikely circumstances. "I think," she said when they parted, "that I've wanted to do that since you broke that lock and set me free." Henry laughed, drawing her close again. "Best impulsive decision I ever made." Behind them, the mountains stood silent witness as two souls who had known loss and loneliness found in each other, the chance to begin again far from iron cages and burning sun, in a place where they could build their future together, one day at a time.